Hi, everyone. Welcome to our August Wireside Chat. And I'm Paul Wickcover, the Associate Dean of the Online MFA. And I'm joined, as I very often am, by Melissa Hart, who is an instructor in the Online MFA program. And our guest tonight is Holley Cornetto, also an instructor in the program. She is a writer, librarian, professor, book reviewer for Publishers Weekly, an anthologist, and a transplanted Southerner who now calls New Jersey home. She is the author of the novels They Are Cursed Like You with S.O. Green in 2023 and We Haunt These Woods in 2022. Her most recent anthology, The Earth Bleeds at Night, was published in January 2025 through Erie River Publishing. So welcome, Holley. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It was an honor to be invited.
Well, the honor is all ours, I assure you. So these are very informal events where we just kind of talk about, all kinds of cool writing related stuff. And one of the things that we always like to ask our guests is, tell us a little bit about your writing journey. How did you get to where you are today?
Well, that's interesting. An interesting question, and that's a little one, right?
Oh, that's
uh,
right.
I have always been a reader, and I always tell people I was a reader first. That's where my love for story came from. When I was young, and in horror specifically. Um, Sorry, I think someone is unmuted.
Yeah, I do see.
Getting a little
Think
feedback.
someone's unmuted. I'm going to see if I can find who that is.
But anyway, so I started, with my love of reading very young. My mother, she was a reader. We always had books with us, carried them around, and so my love of writing stemmed from that. I didn't actually think about writing until much later, and it was kind of a combination of influences that led me to that point. Part of it was reading stories that I just absolutely loved and thought, I would like to do this. Like I would like to try to put something down and sort of experimenting with that. But outside of creative writing, I work as a librarian. I've just always surrounded myself with books and with stories and with things like that. So everything like that I write just comes from that sort of love of just reading. That's where it's rooted.
Who are some of the earliest writers that made you feel like you could become a writer?
Well, my I've always loved horror. I've always been a horror gal, and that's not. I think maybe the funny part is that's not where I started writing at, but it is where I started reading. So like very young, like R.L. Stein, the Goosebumps, and then I eventually like graduated to the Fear Street books. For those of you who are familiar with him, and then from there, did the Stephen King and the John Saul, and the more adult horror from there. But actually, like Terry Pratchett, the specifically, he has a series that's the Tiffany Aching series that is about a girl who's a witch, and it's a really great. I think it might be classified as YA fantasy, but I love the way that Pratchett writes. I love the way that he is sort of clever and he has like the winks at his readers. And it just, I think that's one thing where I realized like more about craft and how to craft a story and write and thinking then about story from like a writer's point of view as opposed to a
Mhm.
reader's point of view.
I could see that. He's kind of a self-referential writer in many ways. Are those books part of the Discworld books?
Yeah, they are in the Discworld series. So like I do like I have since read a lot of those, and like they've got the Night's Watch. There's a lot of like different groups within that, you
Yes.
know what I mean? So he's got
Hmm.
the Night's Watch series, he's got like the witches, and I think
Yeah.
this is probably a subset of the witches, because it does have like your Granny, is it Weatherwax? I forget
Yeah. Yes, it
now, but
is.
Yeah, so it has these characters that reoccur that are in this series as well, but it also has like some tiny little guys called the Feagles, and they're
Yeah.
hilarious.
Is that
But
the little wee men, right?
yes, that's the We
Yeah.
Free Men is one of
Yes, right,
the book
right,
titles. Yeah.
right.
So and thank you for throwing the link in there, Melissa. I appreciate that.
Yeah, such a great writer, and I think you're right. You really can learn a lot from him as a writer. You got a
Yeah.
compliment on your website, Holly.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. It
So
needs an update, but I really do
how
appreciate that.
how often do you update your website?
I haven't updated it in a while because, like I said, the new job has
Yeah.
kept me very busy. But I am due to update it soon because I need to put, um, I want to add the new anthology that came out this year to
Hmm.
my list of editing credits, and some other updates I want to make as well. So there are some things that need to be updated, but generally before it really depended, but I would try to do updates every like 3 to 6 months, depending on what I had going on, or what I needed to change. And that, I mean, one of the classes that I teach in this program is the course in which we do copy and content. So we build out websites. So I appreciate you saying that because now I feel a little more confident in practicing what I preach.
That's right. Yeah, you can confidently send your students to your website. Um, so let's focus in on horror a little bit, if you don't mind. And I guess what I'd like to talk about is your approach to writing horror, and the various like the maybe the kind of fears that you think should be or often are confronted in horror. And I mean that generally, and also maybe personally, if that's something you could talk about in regard to your own work.
Yeah. So generally when I think about horror, I think about it in terms of the immediate and the visceral, but I also think about it in terms of kind of those insidious things that get under your skin and like linger. So when I write horror and when I think about a story, I'm trying to blend those elements because I want things that are going to horrify the reader. I want some measure of shock value, some measure of, just a be able to get a response from the reader. But I also want to address kind of those deeper seated fears or those things that are, within us. And I found blending those things to be a pretty effective strategy because, you know, you have things that grab the reader's attention and hold them in the narrative. Like they're reading to find out what happens next. They're reading to see, oh my gosh. But the deeper, more like, I guess, lingering the elements of the story are the things that after they close the book and they walk away from it that they're going to be thinking about next week or the next week. So when I think about, like, for me in particular, I write a lot about young people. I really like coming of age. I think that there is a really interesting liminal space from the time that you kind of transition from childhood to adulthood, right? Where you're at that age where maybe you still believe in magic, or maybe you still have fears that are maybe childish in some ways. But you also have that lack of believability. Like a lot of times adults won't believe children, and we sometimes as adults minimize children's fears or minimize children's emotions, like, oh, you're young, you'll get over it, or whatever the case is. And I've seen that happen in life, and I see it happen in media, in movies, and in story, where, young people are, kind of brushed off their fears, or whatever. Like if a kid says there's a monster under the bed, we're like, oh, ha ha ha, how cute, or no, it's fine, you're imagining things, or whatever the response is. And for me, I think I like writing about young people because there's still that gap between belief and possibility, and then like the jaded reality of adulthood. So my first novel, or novella, We Haunt These Woods, was one that has a dual timeline. So it dealt with characters in their past as children, and then them as adults kind of dealing with things that happened when they grew up. And it's interesting because the novel that I'm working on revising right now, that I'm about to put out on submission, it has a similar structure. And I've I've come to the realization that I like writing about childhood trauma and how it shapes us as adults, how these things that happen to us as children can haunt us, whether or not we remember exactly why or how. So for me, I think, and I joke about the novel that I'm currently revising, and I call it my childhood trauma novel, because for me, sometimes writing these things are um, cathartic. You know, it helps me to deal with things in my past that happened that, I had trouble coming to terms with and had to deal with, growing up, and things like that. But writing about them and putting them out there and dramatizing them a little and exaggerating a little, because obviously there weren't monsters, no matter how bad it got. Sorry, spoiler alert, there weren't real monsters. Um, but um, but I think writing about it helps you kind of deal with that. It helps me at least deal with some things in my past that didn't sit right with me as an adult. So I think, for me, that's a lot of where it comes from. But I think looking at it from like maybe an outside perspective is that, that's what horror does. Any of these emotions or these dark side of what it means to be human, horror really lets you explore those things. And sometimes, there's, maybe very visceral, in your face things that are unpleasant that happen to people, and how do we deal with that? And sometimes there are these like lingering horrific things that have an impact on our psyche. So I guess that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but that's kind of my approach to horror specifically. And if there is some element of that that I didn't answer, let me know.
Okay. I just want to jump in really quick and just remind people that you can post questions for Holly in the chat, and we will make sure to ask them. Somebody commented on what you just said, Holly, that in a way that I thought was interesting. I'm just going to read it. That makes a lot of sense because children use magical thinking to cope and express themselves. I think that's a great way of writing and a good example of how horror can be therapeutic. So do you think that there is like is the idea of horror being therapeutic, is that a central idea of horror? Is that an aspect of horror that's required in order for there to be good horror, like some kind of confrontation with a fear that winds up being therapeutic?
Um, I'll say it varies on based on subgenre. So horror is one of these like huge genres that is just there's so much variation. And a lot of people, when you say horror, they may think of like the Saw movies, or they may think of this, or they may think of that. And so I think for horror there are some subgenres of horror that really do dig into those things. And I think some of them are ones that, like gothic horror, I think things like folk horror, cosmic horror, some of these more quiet horror genres look at those elements, and they look at the psychological elements more, and it may have that more therapeutic, because they may deal with what does it mean to be human, or what does it mean to be a monster, or even questions like who or what are the real monsters, what is the danger, what should we be afraid of, what's the source of the fear. But then you have some things that are just, you know escape is pulpy, the everything is what it seems on the surface. The monster is the monster, and he's there to chase you and dismember you and maybe murder you. So, and there's not a right or a wrong way necessarily to do it. It really just depends on what the expectations are of like the subgenre that you want to write in, because you have to think about what your audience is looking for. So if I set out to do like a splatter punk novel, it's going to be in your face, visceral, blood everywhere, and it's going to be a little more straightforward. And that's not to say they can't have deeper meaning, they can, but it might be less expected than if you were doing literary horror, if you were doing gothic horror, or something like folk horror, cosmic, any of those more quiet genres.
Mhm.
So not necessary, but depending on subgenre, it might be expected by your readers.
I'm going to pull a question out of the chat. Do you ever get so into your story when writing that it scares you or creeps you out?
Yes. Yes. I've had a couple of stories that I wrote that disturbed me, to a point where I had to stop writing and go do some eye bleach. There is a subreddit called eye bleach, just like r/eye bleach, and it has like cute kitten pictures and things like that. And so sometimes, because I've written stories that have, because I've written a lot of short stories as well. So despite like the novella, the novel, and the novel that I'm working on, the anthologies that I've edited, I don't know, somewhere around maybe 30 short stories that have been published in various anthologies and magazines and things. And sometimes the subject matter can be very bleak. And sometimes you deal with these rough things like bullying. You may deal with child abuse. You may deal with animal abuse. And so I have, written some scenes where I've had to kind of walk away and just breathe and not look at it, and kind of give myself a pep talk through it, and to get it on the paper. But telling myself that, it's for the it's for the sake of the story, right? Like it enhances, because if I'm feeling something and I feel it that strongly, then I believe that the reader will feel it too. So
Mhm.
sometimes you have to push past your comfort levels when you're writing this uncomfortable subject matter, because again, if I feel it, you read it, you're probably going to feel it too.
It's almost like you can sort of steer by that feeling as you're writing.
Yeah, and sometimes, it is intense, and sometimes, but those are, it's kind of one of those things where you have to know your limits, and you have to know like when to walk away, when to take
Mhm.
breaks and things like that, because especially if you're someone who has triggers that think particular things, upset you, or if you have like some psychological, like just things that are just very triggering to you, you obviously need to practice self-care no matter what genre you write in. But I feel like horror is one of those big ones where, you need to make sure that you are okay and do self
Mhm.
check-ins, and to ask yourself, is this okay?
Right, right. I mean, I can't
Holly,
help but
did
think
you?
of, I'm sorry, Melissa, go ahead.
Oh no, Holly, did you already talk about? Did you already give your thoughts on content and trigger warnings? Nicole wanted to know.
Oh, no, I haven't.
Sorry,
And
Holly.
Haley, and I'm sorry, I also want to say, I see Haley, you asked in the chat if any of my books are on Kindle Unlimited. I know that my book, They Are Cursed Like You, I think it looks like this. I think that is on Kindle Unlimited. I'm not sure about We Haunt These Woods. I know it was for a time, so it may still be. So yeah, definitely look on Kindle, because I do believe that. And haha, Paula, is there someone behind me? Thank you. Now, in terms of trigger warnings, so it's like it, this is a very hot button topic with horror authors, and it causes a lot of drama in the horror community of, oh, should you do trigger warnings, and they're reading horror, so shouldn't they like just assume they're going to be triggered. I feel that trigger warnings are can be important. I think that there are certain people who would not read books that they knew were going to trigger them. So if something like sexual assault is triggering, if something like animal death is triggering, those people should still have the right and the ability to enjoy horror. But I also understand the argument about, well, you don't want to do spoilers. If you give trigger warnings, it might spoil the book. So one thing that I've worked on with Erie River is my thoughts about it are putting a something in the front of the book to say trigger warnings listed on page whatever, and putting them in the back so
Hmm.
that if someone wants to know what the trigger warnings are, they can flip to the back of the book, they can look at the trigger warnings. If you don't want to look at the trigger warnings, then you don't have to like flip through that page and accidentally get spoiled, right? So
Hmm.
I personally think that trigger warnings should exist, but I mean, I understand both arguments, and I don't think that we have a standard. If you post on any social media and you say you should have trigger warnings, you're going to get like people like, how dare you, how and if you come and you post they shouldn't, you're going to get the same thing. So I think it's really a personal decision that the authors need to make with their publishers, based on, again, what subgenre are you writing in, so and what are the expectations for that, and you know, what your publisher also, if they have a standard, because some publishers will do this regardless because that's part of their policy. Because in horror we have a really great indie community, so we have a lot of small presses who are putting out a lot of things, and some of them have very clear, like, we do trigger warnings, and some of them have very clear, we don't. So I'd say also do your homework if you're looking at small publishers, to make sure that your ideas align with theirs, or that at least it's something that you can live with, that you can get behind. So yeah, I think that's probably the closest I can come to a definitive answer. I'm sorry.
I really love that idea of putting the trigger warnings in the back because that leaves the choice to the reader.
Exactly.
And yeah, and both camps are happy. It's a good compromise.
Oh no, both
Well,
camps are never happy.
well, they're equally pissed off.
Yes, that's pretty much it. It's just like you just decide to make everybody a little bit mad.
Mhm. All right, here's a question I'm going to pull from the chat. When you write subgenres, is it best to choose a topic you're not as passionate about so that your feelings are not portrayed to the reader, or would you say it's the opposite?
I I I like writing with passion, and maybe I guess it depends, because I think for me, one of the central reasons why I think a lot of people read is for a feeling. I think that Donald Mass has a great book that I'm currently working through for the second time, called The Emotional Craft of Fiction, I think is the name of the book. It may not be the exact title, but it's very close. And in this, he goes into a lot of detail about how we feel often through the characters, either their actions, their choices, things that are said or not said. But a lot of people, when they read because they want to be moved emotionally, or they want to feel certain types of emotions. Like, for example, with horror, we might want to feel unsettled. We might want to feel a little off kilter. If we're reading romance, we might want to feel like, happy and lighthearted with a happily ever after. We might want to experience dangerous situations in horror that, we know ultimately we're safe, but this lets us like take a little walk on the wild side, right? So for me, I think that having feeling into, if you can channel it into the fiction, and channel that emotion and those feelings into the writing, whether it's through the characters or whatever, I think that's usually the best thing, because I think that your readers, like, if you're writing something and you're not invested, I think that may come across to your readers. They may read it and feel disconnected. Now, there may be some literary genres or some styles that's an advantage. But I think for certain genres, in particular horror and romance, I think that feeling is an important aspect of it. So I'd say dig into it if you can. And I would say, if you're not interested in a subgenre, why would you want to write about it? What would be the appeal there? If you're doing it for market reasons, I don't know that that's always the best way to go about it. So I'd say, yeah, try to do what you're passionate about if you can.
I think sometimes there's this sense among beginning writers that they have to keep a certain emotional distance from what they're putting on the page. If they're letting their own feelings spill out, they're kind of I don't know, overwhelming maybe some aspects of the work. And so maybe that's, where that question is coming from. Do you have to be emotionally aloof in order to write with a certain degree of like control? Or are you able to uh, you know, be passionate and tap into your feelings and still do that with, the artistic control that you obviously hope to exercise in your work? I mean, how have you approached that in your own work?
So I live in revisions. I make ugly, dirty, nasty drafts. My first drafts are just, they're disgusting. I'm embarrassed to show them to anybody. Sometimes they're just patchwork things, and I know this. And I also, when I teach some of the courses, when I'm working with my students, we talk about drafting, especially in the storytelling course. We talk about like writing an outline, writing a draft, and what a draft looks like. And for me, my drafts are what I call skinny drafts, because they're very bare bones, and it's like very like plot, some dialogue, like this person says this and this person says this, and it's a lot of white room syndrome. It's a lot of like just dut 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 dut. And then when I go back and I start to revise, those are the places where I start looking at, have I filled in the setting, have I filled in the emotional beats, have I done this, have I done that. And then also looking at those places, like what you mentioned, Paul, about where have I matched this tonally appropriately for the emotions that I want to convey to the reader. Are my characters portraying these emotions adequately, accurately, and are they believable? So, for example, my current um, book that I'm in revisions with, one of the first times I went back and I read that draft, I'm like, oh my God, my protagonist is crying in every other chapter. Like, this is not good. So I had to go back and I had to look at those beats and see, what can I change? Like, what is a better reaction? How, because when I'm drafting, I'm just thinking, oh, sad moment, right? But I think that those are places where, once you go through, so my revision process is, you do the draft, you put it away, you come back a little while later, you look at it. And so my next revision is filling in any plot holes, any place where I've just made notes, like write this scene later, things like
Mhm.
that. That's the first set of revisions. Then I go in, I do another read through, and I start filling in, like I said, setting, and making sure I'm hitting those emotional beats. And I think in that round of revision is where I would look at my emotional distance as the author. So am I presenting this in, you know, if you're writing in a more literary style, or if you're using like particular like flourishes with your prose, looking at those and saying, am I doing this well? Am I doing it too much? But at that point, that's when I go back and I map out intent in terms of like what my prose looks like structurally, and what I'm trying to do as an author in terms of presentation, like whether that's a more literary style, whether it's a fast-paced thriller style. But it's in those revisions where I take care of that. So I'd say in your first draft, just put it all out there. And you're either going to end up, some people are the exact opposite of me. When they draft, it's fat, it's huge, it's giant, and they have to cut, 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 cut. And there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's just different. Some people want to get the details down, and some people want to write everything and then start looking at what are the important elements. And nobody has a process figured out that's perfect. But in either of those processes, I think that that comes in maybe your second or third round of revisions, is making sure that the intent is what you mean it to be.
Here's a question. Do you use a specific writing app to help write the first draft and revisions? And if you do you recommend it? Or could you recommend it?
I have not for a long time. Usually my drafts are in like Microsoft Word. And that's partially because I want to be able to work arguably without distractions. So I can open up Microsoft Word if I don't have an internet connection, and I can just work on the document. And I don't have a bajillion tabs open that's blinking. Oh, I've got an email. Oh, I've got this stack of things I've got to grade or whatever it is that's distracting me. Or, oh, pretty shiny YouTube video. Let's go down this rabbit hole, right? So I like Word for drafting for that. But I recently have been dabbling with a software called AutoCrit. And I haven't drafted in it, but what I did was I uploaded my completed draft of my novel into it. And what it does is it'll give you story analysis, and it'll go chapter by chapter, or you can do the whole thing. So I uploaded my whole novel draft into it, and I did a summary analysis, and it tries to pick out themes in your work, and it'll tell you like this chapter hit this thematic note and this chapter hit this thematic note. It'll try to point out inconsistencies, so places where a character in one scene does something, and then maybe the next chapter they do something that seems a little different. It's not perfect because in my particular story, I have a character who is acting a little inconsistent for reasons related to the plot. And it kept telling me these were mistakes, but I was just like, no, that's good. That's good that they're not acting like you think they should. So I would say that sometimes these programs can be helpful as long as you can use them and not be distracted by them. AutoCrit is, like I said, it's the first one that I've really experimented with. I will use it again, probably because I'm not finished with revisions on my novel right now. So I will probably use it again. And I did recommend it to my husband, who's also a writer, to throw his story in and to just see, because it's good for things like checking your themes, making sure that you're making the points that you want to make. So I would say if you have the bandwidth for something like that, it could be useful for those things. But these things cost money. So the other question is like, can you afford it? Is it equitable? Is it something sustainable? Because, especially if you're a new writer and you're a student and you may not have a lot of money to spend. So I'd say, are they necessary? No. Even something like that, if you're open to using like AI programs, you could probably give it a scene and say, could you pick out the themes in this and tell me what they are? So these are just tools, and I would say that they're not in any way necessary, but they could, when used with caution, they could enhance, certain elements of your fiction. So yeah, there you go. That long story short, AutoCrit, neat, not vital.
Yeah. Is that an AI program? AutoCrit?
No, I think it has maybe an AI function in it. It doesn't like draft or anything for you, but you can ask it questions. So you upload your story,
Okay.
and you can ask it questions about your draft, and it'll try to answer those questions based on what you've given it. But it also, what I like about it, it doesn't sell your stuff to outside. It doesn't share it with
Yep.
outside like programs or anything, because I'm really big about like intellectual property and things
Oh,
like
yeah.
that. So
Yeah.
so that was important to me. But yeah, again, I'm just playing around with it. So it's new. And I see Christopher said, I really like Readsy for the organization element. It has free and membership plans. I'll have to look at that. I haven't used Readsy, but I do like their resources. I often use them, their videos, and a lot of their like templates and stuff in some of the classes that I teach.
Yeah.
I give a lot of supplemental things from Readsy. I think they're a really great resource. So I'll have to look into that, Chris. Thank you for that.
I agree with you. I mean, we use Readsy in bunch of classes as resources. So just to stick really quick with your revision process, because I find it super interesting. Do you do all your revising, all these multiple iterations of revision, do they all take place on your computer, or are you printing work out and then marking it up and re-inputting it? How does that work for you?
I usually the first, so well, okay, it depends is the answer. But with this most recent novel, the one that I'm finishing right now, I did 2 rounds of revisions electronically, then I printed it out.
Okay.
And because I am of the generation where I I still like pen and paper. I like physical copies. I mean, I have like a physical calendar. That's just I feel like I read more closely and with better intent if I can read words on the paper. So I read with a highlighter. I read with a pen, and I go through. I print it out, and I just mark up anything that I see that I either should shore up a little more. Sometimes when I'm reading it through, I'll get ideas for things I should add. Like, oh, this would enhance the scene if I add like this element. Like, I think there was one part where I had 2 characters who had had a misunderstanding, and I was like, oh, let me add something later where she's still mad about this. Like, she's still like kind of
Hmm.
giving her the side eye. And those are things that I caught when reading through and doing the physical copy, and then I would just write on that physical copy, like add this here or something like that. Or if I had an idea for how to word it, I might add the wording there. So then after I did that, I went back to the electronic copy and I went through the physical copy page by page and transcribed those changes into the digital copy. And so did that. And then now the revision I'm working on is again still in Word, and I probably won't print it out again. So I'm doing, like I said, I'm doing the autocrit thing to see, because one of the things it'll do, it'll point out where you use too many filter or filler phrases. It'll point
Hmm.
out passive language. So, because right now, at this point, most of the edits I'm making are like line edits, so they're phrasing. Like if I've said he felt this or I felt this, I'll go in and I'll take that out, and then I'll put like the showing instead of the telling, or whatever the case may
Hmm.
be. Um, and then once I finish with this last round and these polish moments, then I'll send it to my 2 critique partners. So I have two critique partners that have read my writing since probably day one. One of them I met when I was doing my own MFA. He was in the MFA program with me, and that's why I always tell students, treasure the connections that you make in these MFA programs. If you meet someone who writes in a similar genre to you and you enjoy reading what they're writing, reach out to that person, stay in touch with them, because I have stayed in touch with this person and we have been critique partners. We still meet every week and we talk about writing, we talk about our goals, our progress, and he reads everything I write before I send it out, and I read everything he writes before he sends it out. So these connections, like, this is where you meet your people. So take advantage of that to the fullest. But yeah, so once I'm finished with this round of revisions, I'll send it to him. I'll give it to my other critique partner, who's my husband, who's also a writer. And then I'll make their changes. And then once if I'm happy with it after that, that's when I'm probably going to start. For this one, I think I'm actually going to start subbing out and looking for an agent for. I
Okay.
haven't done that before. I've done small press publishing, but I think for this one, I'm going to query some agents and see how it goes.
That's awesome. I'm glad that you mentioned that your husband is one of your critique partners. I was going to ask you about that because it can be difficult, right, to have 2 writers in the house. I don't know how many of you are in a situation like that or have been in a situation like that. My wife is a playwright, and she is always we're writing in different genres. I'm writing novels, she's writing plays, but still there's that kind of overlap there. Um, What are your tips for survival in a household of two writers?
I actually love it because we tease and I say he's my other brain or my auxiliary brain. Because it's one of those things where like so he writes fantasy mostly, and I write horror mostly. But we will brainstorm with each other. Like if we're out walking the dogs and it's like, oh, I've got this problem. Like my character needs to do this, and I don't know how to make this happen. And we'll just kind of like bounce things off one another. And and sometimes we're way off the mark. It's like, well, what if your character did this? It's like, no, that's ridiculous. They'd never do that. But sometimes it's like, what if your character did this? And it's like, what if my character did that? And so it can be a really good thing. And also, it in terms of working, it's really helpful because I don't have to feel guilty locking myself away for a few hours every night to write because he's also writing. So more often than not, we have trouble writing at home because we've got little dogs that are very demanding. They're drama queens, both of them. They think that all our time is their time and they run the house. And we also have daughters, but the dogs really run the show. So a lot of times we have to go out and like leave the house in order to be able to get things done. And we'll do that together, and it doesn't feel like you're taking away because even though you're not necessarily working together, you're still together, but you have someone who understands that priority, who understands how important the story is to you and writing is to you. It's not trivialized. You've got a supporter, you've got someone who has your back. So for me, I value that a lot. I also value being able to bounce ideas off. He has written at least one story that was published in a magazine that was based off a dream I had, that I was like, I had this really crazy dream and I think you could make a story with it. But it's the same thing because he's given me an idea for a story that I actually published as well in an anthology that was based on a dream that he had. So I mean, it's just little things like that that really it's a good partnership. So I do enjoy it, but I can see how like some people might not, and how sometimes there might be like ego or there might be other things involved. But and Nicole, mine are part Chihuahuas, so that's probably why. um, but yeah, so it's for me that it's a good thing because we make it into a partnership where we really do understand each other's priorities and try to help each other to the fullest. I understand not everybody's may work in that way, but for us it works out really well.
That sounds great. I'm happy for you. It's just, I mean, I think having a partnership like that is huge. Let me pull another question out of the chat here. Is a critique partner different than a beta reader? And at what stage do you consult outside perspectives, and do you revise after consulting those perspectives?
So I think that the language is a little gives you a little, but for me, yes, a beta reader is different from a critique partner. A beta reader is someone that I might have read in earlier stages, and I haven't used beta readers yet for this particular book. I haven't felt like I've been to the point where I needed them, but I've also had beta readers happen later in the process. So my publisher, one for They Are Cursed Like You, once we turned in the manuscript to the publisher sent it out to their beta readers. So the publisher had a team of beta readers, and they had a questionnaire that they asked the beta readers to fill out. And so that went to the beta readers. They came back with their feedback, and then we were presented with that. And this particular publisher, there was some leeway with like what corrections we made and what we didn't, but it was just feedback for us to decide what to do with. For me, my critique partners, get my drafts when, like, quite frankly, if I'm speaking bluntly, I just don't know what the heck to do with it anymore. Once I get to the point where I've revised it and I look at it and I'm like, okay, I don't know how to make this better. Like, I don't, it, like, and I'm making changes and I'm like, I don't know if these changes are actually improving the story or if I'm just moving things around and rearranging it. So when I need like a more impartial, like, perspective, that's the point, because a lot of times I've lived with the story in my head for so long that I know things about the story and the world that I feel maybe color and shape what I'm writing and what I'm presenting to the reader. And I need to know if it makes sense to someone who doesn't live in my brain. So at that point, that's when I will send it out to the beta readers, or I mean, sorry, my critique partners, and get polish on it. But for me, that comes late in the process because I want to make all of the changes that I can make confidently before I get outside feedback, because I don't want them to waste their time telling me things I already know are problems, right?
Hmm.
So if I know I overuse certain words or phrases, like looked, everybody looks all the time. Like she looked here, I looked there, I looked at her, she looked at me. We're always looking in my drafts. So I always go through and I do searches for these things and try to eliminate these things that I know. And part of that's knowing yourself as a writer and knowing what your strengths and weaknesses are so that you can edit for that. But once I get all those things that I know are my weak areas, and again, I just don't know, like I've got blind spots, that's when it goes to my critique partners.
That's interesting. I've never actually heard the distinction between a beta reader and a critique partner uh, put so well. I mean, it makes perfect sense when you look at it that way. I think my critique partner in that regard is my agent. He's the person that I send things to when I feel like, all right, I've done everything I can. I know it's not perfect, but and then he is able to usually uh, help me out.
I
So
think
let me
I
shift
think for
gears. Oh, I'm
me,
sorry. Go ahead,
I
please.
just want to add one quick thing. I think
Yep.
for me, a beta reader, it's not as important that they know how to write, that they're writers. You can just get readers to beta read and tell you problems they see with the story. Anybody who reads books, who reads, can be a beta reader. But for me, for critique partners, I specifically want someone who knows something about the craft of writing. So
Yep.
because at that level, I want someone who can help with those things that only a writer might pick up on. So there's one
Yep.
distinction. Sorry. Sorry, go
And
ahead,
I
Paul.
guess it would no, I guess it would also be helpful to like have a critique partner and maybe even beta readers as well who are, conversant in the genre that you're writing in.
Absolutely.
So what I was going to do was kind of jump to a different topic because I know we're running a little short of time, and I wanted to talk about book reviewing because I know that's something that you've done. That's something that I've done, and I think it's sort of a good side gig that a writer can get that kind of gets their name out there, and makes them conversant with not just what's being published right now, but gives them a means to kind of formulate their relationship to what's being published right now with the reader in mind, because that's what book reviews are for.
Absolutely.
So can you talk a little bit about like your experience with book reviewing, what you've gotten out of it, how writers might break into it if it's something they're interested in?
Absolutely. So I've done a lot of different reviewing for different platforms, some of it paid, some of it not paid. So it really just depends on what you're looking to do with the reviews. Because some places, like, for example, Publishers Weekly, they pay per review, but you don't have your name credited to that review. So you could say, like, I review for Publishers Weekly, but it's very important for them to have anonymity or an anonymity. I don't know. I'll think of the word later. But it's important for the reviewers to be able to be anonymous so that they can be honest without fear of any kind of backlash, without fear of because there are horror stories. Like I heard a story a while back about like an author who like stalked a reviewer who gave them a bad review. So there are like some and not to deter you, that's kind of an anomaly for those things happening. But anyway, for that particular publication, the advantage is you get paid, right? And they give you free books and you get paid. But the disadvantage is you don't get credit for it. So it really depends on what you're doing it for. If you're doing it to get free books, to read more in your genre, and to maybe make a little side income, I recommend Publishers Weekly, Booklist, and Kirkus are all places that pay for reviews. And it varies how much they pay. I think from anywhere from $20 to maybe 40, depending on which publication you're reviewing for. If you're more interested,
You're not going to get rich as a book reviewer.
oh no,
You're not going to get rich as a book reviewer.
no, the advantage is free books. And again, just some money for reading them. And I guess one of the disadvantages is you don't always get to pick what you're reading. Like you could, like for example, for me, I said I would like to read horror as my primary, and then maybe like fantasy as the secondary. But they'll send you the title they want you to review, so it's not like you're picking out exactly what you're reading. How fast do you have to read? I see a question from Christopher. It varies, but usually I was expected one book a month at minimum, but you could do more if you read faster. And again, that's for places that pay you, that are publishing them in print or something like that, or and so they have more of a turnaround time because of publication dates. If you want to do reviews to be more like, I don't know, a tastemaker or opinion, a person whose opinion is looked on in your genre. If you're looking to position yourself as an authority figure, then you might look at publications, even if they don't pay, that publish reviews in your genre. So for example, one of the places that, as a horror person, I've published reviews. There's a website called the Ginger Nuts of Horror, and then there's one called Horror Tree. And those are two places where I would often publish reviews that I had written. And again, they didn't offer any kind of compensation. You still got the books for free. And in those particular instances, you could pick what you were reviewing. So I could, if I saw a book that had come out that I was really interested in reviewing, I could request it. Or sometimes they'd send a list from the publishers and say, we have all these books. Are there any of them that any of you want to review? And then you could say, yeah, could you send me this one? Could you send me this one? And then they send you that. And with those types of, smaller organizations like that don't pay, they're a little more lenient with time frames. So for like Horror Tree, for example, there was never like a deadline. It was just we'll get it in when you get it in, and then we'll schedule it when it's done. They tried to prioritize if there were like things that were coming out on release, then they would say, is it possible to have this done by the release date, or like maybe the week that it's releasing, to help the author promote the book, and to do some promotional work with them or for them. And in those cases, they would let you know. But for me, it was never a deal breaker. If I was like, no, I can't make that deadline. So yeah, it really depends on where you're looking to place the review, whether you're getting paid or whether you're doing it more, as sort of an exercise in learning, and in an exercise of positioning yourself as an authority figure in your genre.
Right. I mean, that's kind of a question I'm going to pull out of the chat here. Would book reviews be considered publishing credits for your resume, queries, website, or MFA applications?
I'm not sure. I do mention that I'm a reviewer, and usually in my bio. So when I am sharing it, but because I've published with like Publishers Weekly and stuff, I haven't like linked out those reviews, but will say that I am a regular reviewer for such and such site and such site. On my actual website, I do link out links to book reviews that are published with my name on them. So I think that in terms of putting it on applications, I think that it never hurts to mention it. I think that it, in cover letters or in application materials, that especially if you're publishing places like, that pay for reviews, I think that might be a little more prestigious, you know, uh, than than places that don't. But I don't think that's to say to discount it, because reviewing books is a really it's a valuable enterprise if you can do it, if you have the bandwidth to do it, because it teaches you a lot about what works and what doesn't work in story, and particularly for you, because my opinion on a book, we may read the same book and I may love it and you may hate it, and there may be different reasons. Not everybody's gonna, I mean, if you, any book that you look at, if you go to Goodreads, it's gonna have, it doesn't matter how wonderful or how great the book is, it's gonna have like a 1-star review from someone. Like someone's just going to be like, no, I hated this. So I think that that's, valuable, and it's good to get to learn about what you think about story and how story works. I think it gets you thinking about books and about about story and about story structure and storytelling elements in a completely different way than what you might normally.
Yeah. I
Let's
mean,
see.
when
I
you
see.
have to,
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, when when you're writing a book review, you have to kind of take the book apart that you're reviewing and in your head and present it to your readers in a comprehensible way, right? You have to give them enough of the plot that they can understand. If it's a book that they're going to like, you have to be able to talk about the characters. I mean, you're bringing skills that you utilize in your own writing to bear in reviewing the work of somebody else, I think, when you're book reviewing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to, I think that there was one person who I'd spoken to who had this conundrum about the star rating system. Like, what does it mean? Like, why do we use a star rating system? Because of those things. Like, if I like something, you may not like it, or whatever the case may be. And I think this person that I had this discussion with had come to the conclusion that they weren't going to star any reviews at all. They were just going to say,
Mm,
you will enjoy this book if you like XYZ. And leave
yeah.
it at that, instead of putting their opinion on it. So I thought that was a really interesting, and I think that that's more in line with like your something like your Publishers Weekly, and things like that, because for them, they don't have like a star system. They have, you either you get a star or you don't, and the only ones that get stars are things that are very exceptional, but most things don't get stars. So I think that it's an interesting way to think about it, like what's opinion versus what is like being observant, breaking down story, and talking about who these different things will appeal to. I see, Lindsay, you asked in the chat, did you ever publish any fiction before nonfiction? Is the process different? Do you like fiction, or did you at one point in your life? Yeah, I publish both. So I do fiction and nonfiction. I haven't published any long form nonfiction. All my nonfiction that's been published so far has pretty much been reviews, but I do write in academic spaces too. So in my other life, I'm an academic librarian. So I do some academic writing too. My undergraduate was in history. So I do like the nonfiction space is just pretty much as much. But I just like telling stories, I think. So fiction writing is probably where my heart is. Um, let's see, I just saw a question from Haley. When reviewing, what if you can't finish reading the book? What happens then? It depends on where you're reviewing for. So if you're like, so when I was when I was reviewing for Publishers Weekly, if it was something like, if there were like triggers, or if there was just a deadline or something like that, I had an editor that I would reach out to, and I'd say, I can't finish this for whatever reason. And then that editor would either reassign it, or whatever the case may be, depending on what the issue was. If it's just a book that I was reading and I was like, I objectively cannot review this for whatever reason, they would reassign it to someone else and give you another one. If like I've had a medical emergency and I just can't do this, then it's like, okay, we'll do what we need to do and go get well soon. If it is for a smaller publication, I think it's just understood in a lot of those instances that some things like that will happen inevitably. Because I never want to publish just a terrible review for someone. Like I subscribe to the, if you can't say anything, at least sort of nice. I would not, because just being an author, like I have a lot of empathy for authors, and I've heard so many people say, you know, I self-published a book when I first started out, and I didn't know what I was doing, and it got terrible reviews, and then I never wanted to write again. And like I never want to be the reason why a writer gives up, because I feel like we can always improve and always get better. So if it comes to the point where I'm reading something and I'm like, I could not give this a nice review, I just would not review it. And like, you know, again, tell the editor, you know, I'm sorry, but you know, I know I plan to review this, but I can't. If you'd like to pass it on to someone else, you know, that you're welcome to, and leave it at that. And I have had people have given me books to review, and I did not like the books, and I couldn't say anything necessarily very positive about it, and they've confronted me like, why didn't you review my book, why didn't you review my book? And you know, I gave you a copy of my book, and I said to them, I said, you know, I you know, I would be happy to give you my notes if you would like to see my notes, but you know, my notes are, you know, things that I think should be improved upon, you know, and things like that. And it doesn't always go over that well, but that's, again,
No,
that's an
sure.
anomaly. Like I've only had like maybe one person ever like confront me, like, why didn't you review my book? And it was a little awkward.
Yeah.
But we made it.
That, right. That doesn't happen often. So we're kind of at the end of our hour. I want to pull one more question from the chat before we go. I think it's a great question to end on. Do you have any advice you wish you had received before you were published the first time?
I think just keep in mind that you're at the start of your journey, that the first thing you publish isn't necessarily going to be your best work ever. And don't, I think a lot of people, a lot of writers, especially new writers, suffer from imposter syndrome, you know, and don't compare like your work to Stephen King's work or something like that when you're first starting out. Like nobody expects you to be at that level. And some people are, and that's great if you're already writing, you know, at a really high level. But don't expect the first thing that you write and the first thing even that you publish to be like your greatest work, but don't let that hold you back either. You know, put it out there, put it on submission, and try. Don't self reject. If you see a venue that you want to submit to, even if you think it's a long shot, take the long shot. The worst thing they can do is tell you no. And as a writer, you're going to get a lot of no's. So you might as well go ahead and start getting used to it. We all get a lot of no's. That's just part of it. And just, you know, see how you can take criticism with a thick skin, knowing that, you know, from a growth mindset, that if somebody does read it and they give you feedback and they say, you know, this is not good and blah, 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 try not to take it personally. Try to, because not everyone's good at giving feedback. But you, regardless of whether other people are good at giving feedback, you can get good at taking feedback. So you can even look at these like things that seem very harsh. After you take a few minutes to process your emotions, then look at it and analyze it for, is there any truth in this? Like aside from the emotions, aside from the feelings I feel, aside from the words that I think are harsh, are there any true like nuggets of wisdom in this feedback? And if there's not, there's not, and that's fine. Some people are just cruel and mean, and you know, you just disregard it. But sometimes people just, you know, don't necessarily know how to deliver criticism with tact, and they may still have a valid critique for you. So those are my things. You know, just don't sell yourself short. Don't assume that it's always going to be great at first. Learn to take criticism. Learn to be able to read between the lines when you get feedback.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that wisdom. I mean, they're all super important things to remember. So that brings us to the end of our August Wireside Chat. I want to thank Holley so much for joining us tonight. And Melissa, thank you as well. And thanks everyone in the audience. And we will be back in September, the second Monday of the month, with our guests to be announced. Hope everyone has a great rest of the month of August. And we'll see you in September. Bye, everyone.